Gosh, you really should knock. But come on in, come on in. I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. Most of us are familiar with the atrocities committed by the Nazi Party during the Second World War, specifically its research and experimentation into biological warfare. To hear or read about some of the activity that took place in Nazi Germany during that time is to question human sanity. But what if I told you that not only did the United States conduct similar activity with the full endorsement of the highest level of the U.S. government, but that it actually hired the man who had run the Nazis' biological warfare division to bring the U.S. up to speed? And that following the war, the CIA created its own super-secret biological warfare division. A chemist named Sidney Gottlieb was in charge of that division. In his book, Poisoner-in-Chief, journalist, author, and senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, Stephen Kinzer describes how Gottlieb went on to build an empire in the CIA in the 1950s and 1960s that perpetuated brutalities on unsuspecting victims at much the same level as the Nazis. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So, Stephen, while you illustrate some of the really disturbing activities that Sidney Gottlieb initiated and carried out while he headed the chemical division of the CIA's Technical Services Staff, or the TSS, you also made several important points about how Gottlieb, his associates, and many politicians at the time, which was the beginning of the Cold War, believed very deeply in that all the horrors they carried out were justified because of that global situation. And secondly, you spoke about Gottlieb's contradictory alter ego as a peaceful spiritual man. Take us through that period of history and how Gottlieb ended up where he did.
This is really an amazing story. I have to tell you, this is my 10th book. I've written a lot of things that have shocked some people and that have surprised me, but this is really the first time I have been shocked. I still can't really wrap my mind around the fact that there was this chemist named Sidney Gottlieb at the CIA, and there was this program that he ran called MK Ultra. He was conducting the most intense and extreme experiments on human beings that have ever been conducted by any officer or agent of the US government. So what was MK Ultra? What was Gottlieb doing? At the beginning of the Cold War, the CIA became terrified at the thought that the Soviets, the communists, as we called them then, had developed the key to mind control. They were able to manipulate people from far away. They found a way to take out the mind out of someone's brain and put a new mind in there. This was a terrifying threat. Therefore, we had to figure out how to do this also. Now, it turned out that the Soviets had not figured out how to do this. And in fact, as Gottlieb concluded 10 years later, you can't do this. This is just a made up story that people come up with when they read a lot of fiction books and see a lot of movies. But in the Cold War mindset, everything seemed possible. The worst of the enemy was always presumed to be the logical presumption. So we had already been conditioned to believe that the Soviets were preparing to annihilate us at any moment. The idea that they would have this even more diabolical plan to capture the world through mind control just seemed like the logical next step. It may seem extreme, and it does seem extreme from our perspective, but it shows you how intense the Cold War narrative was. So Gottlieb, as a good chemist, a good scientist, started out his search for mind control by asking himself, what research already exists? Who's out there that already is knowledgeable about this subject? Who knows how to destroy a human mind and a human brain and a human spirit and a human body? Well, who was it but the Nazis from the concentration camps and their Japanese counterparts, who in some cases had conducted experiments that were even more gruesome than what went on in the concentration camps. So the person you mentioned, for example, Kurt Bloema, was the chief of the biological warfare effort of the Nazis and was involved in the creation of all sorts of poisons, including poisons that were used in these famous experiments in concentration camps. He was brought before the Nuremberg tribunal to be tried for war crimes. But back in Washington, the idea perked up, we don't want to hang this guy. We want to hire him. And so Kurt Bloema and other Nazis came to work for the CIA. They worked under Sidney Gottlieb, who was in overall charge of this mind control project. And the amazing thing is that Sidney Gottlieb himself was Jewish and the son of immigrants from Central Europe. If his parents had not made the decision to leave Europe in the early 20th century, they might easily have been arrested by the Nazis, and young Sidney could have become the victim of one of these Nazi horrors in a concentration camp. But in the event, he grew up in America, and he never seemed to have any problem working with the same Nazi doctors who had carried out all those experiments. And the explanation, as you suggest, is we have to put aside little details like that these guys were Nazis who worked in concentration camps and tortured people together, or they were in the Nazi SS. We got to forget that now. That's not important. We're fighting the communists. And with that mindset, Gottlieb was given what amounts to a license to kill by the US government. And we still don't know. We'll probably never know how many people died under the intense experiments that he directed as part of the MK Ultra project.
And during that time, what was committed in the name of keeping up with the communists, it's mind-boggling. And one of the more disgraceful episodes during his leadership took place in the early 1950s, involving George Hunter White, who was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, and they established what was paradoxically called the safe houses. What went on in those places, and how are those two men able to justify that?
This was just one of the many projects that Gottlieb embarked on. So his idea was to find ways to destroy human minds. To do this, he tested every kind of drug that he could imagine and combinations of drugs that he himself concocted, and he would apply these along with electroshock and sensory deprivation and extreme heat and cold and all sorts of other torments, which later, thanks to him, have become part of the U.S. handbook in dealing with problems in the world. So one of the many questions that Gottlieb asked himself was, how would men behave after sex if they were also given heavy doses of drugs? Would there be some way you would loosen people's minds this way? So in order to figure this out, he opened up what amounted to a national security bordello in San Francisco and up on Telegraph Hill. And he had an agent there, this fellow you mentioned, George Hunter White, who was an agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. White set up this national security whorehouse and had a guy bring in about a half a dozen girls who would go out and meet men, bring them into this safe house, drug them with whatever drug Sidney Gottlieb wanted to test that week. And then this obese drug agent, George Hunter White, would watch through a one-way window while sitting on a portable toilet and drinking martinis out of a pitcher. So this was no kind of science. I mean, this went way beyond anything that any scientist would consider reasonable, but it just shows the extremes to which Gottlieb and the CIA were willing to go. Now, I did find in my research in an obscure document, testimony by one of the agents who worked with George Hunter White in putting this whorehouse together. And he said something interesting. He said, every time that Sidney Gottlieb would come out here from Washington to examine how the project was going, incidentally, the project was called Operation Midnight Climax.
Oh my gosh.
He would come to me and say, I want a girl. It was always girls. Every time he came here, he needed me to supply him with women, and those women never charged him. They were friends of mine They all did it for nothing as a favor to me. I found this in an obscure court deposition. So this made me think maybe there was another motivation for Gottlieb to set up this whole operation. And maybe it was partly to test drugs and sex, but it was also an excuse for him to get away from home and go to San Francisco and have fun whenever he wanted to.
So I guess he had some perks that came with the position.
It was definitely a perk of office. Maybe not as good as the license to kill, but certainly more fun.
And he seemed to be obsessed with the powers of LSD. And as you described it in the book, he was the first acid visionary. And in fact, he was the one that introduced Allen Ginsberg to LSD. Tell us about that. And also, you pointed out that he concluded that LSD would not work for mind control.
So Gottlieb was fascinated with LSD. He truly believed that it might become, as one of his associates put it, the key that could unlock the universe. In other words, the key to mind control. It was so effective in such small doses, and no odor. It seemed like a perfect drug. And so Gottlieb, in 1953, persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD, which the CIA did. We bought it from Sandoz, the manufacturer in Switzerland. It came to the United States. Now, Gottlieb began to distribute it in different ways. Some of it was used in horrific, brutal experiments. I found one that took place in a federal prison in Kentucky, where 7 African-American inmates were segregated and given triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days without being told what it was or what was happening to them. The goal, of course, being to find out, can you destroy a human mind this way? And the answer evidently is yes, you can. However, one thing Gottlieb realized is that although he figured out how to destroy a human mind, he never found a way to put a new mind in there. So that was the coercive aspect of LSD. But Gottlieb also wanted to know how ordinary people would respond to LSD in a clinical setting and being informed of what was happening to them. So the CIA did not have the facilities to carry out clinical research. Therefore, the CIA, Gottlieb personally, created a couple of bogus medical foundations, which were actually CIA fronts. These foundations wrote to universities, hospitals, clinics around the country and announced very clearly, we have this new drug, LSD, it's psychoactive. We want to test it on volunteers. Anybody that wants to participate in this project, we will send them the LSD. You will then advertise in the newspaper for volunteers. You'll pay them with money that we will supply. And then you'll write reports for us and send them back to us. So overnight, a whole new market for LSD research suddenly grew up naturally, since all the money was out there. And experiments began in which ordinary people could come in and try this yet unknown psychoactive drug. So who were among the very first people who came in? Well, one of them was Allen Ginsberg, who took LSD in a clinic that got its LSD from Sidney Gottlieb. Another one was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who also loved LSD, then brought it home to the members of the Grateful Dead and started their parties. Another one was Ken Keezy, who wrote that classic One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He loved LSD so much that he got a job in the hospital. That was where he got the information for his book. But as he wrote later, he didn't get the job in the hospital for that reason. He got the job so he could steal the LSD and take it out to show it to all his friends. And the word got around, and LSD got around. So it was the leaks from Gottlieb's MK Ultra experiments that brought LSD to America. I found an interview with John Lennon in which he was asked about LSD. And he said, "We must always remember to thank the CIA." Now, he had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. Nobody ever had. But if he had, he would have said, "We must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb. So the irony of the whole story, of course, is that the drug that Sidney Gottlieb hoped would give the CIA the tool to control the world wound up fueling a generational rebellion inside the United States that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA believes in.
And he still didn't find his solution for mind control. It's
true. At the end, he concluded, as we would now say is obvious, that LSD is too unpredictable. Makes some people talk, makes some people shut up, makes some people tell lies. You can't tell what it's going to do. So after many years and the destruction of many lives, Gottlieb put that aside, as he had put aside so many other drugs after administering them to so many people in so many unsuccessful, torturous experiments.
But no, he wasn't just limited to that chemical aspect of it. You also spoke about how he became involved with designing and producing those tools and devices that are kind of reminiscent of the spy and espionage movies that we're used to seeing. And so you have some amusing anecdotes about the association between those films and real life espionage. For instance, how episodes of Mission Impossible in the 1960s and 70s generated all these phone calls coming into the CIA after that program aired. Tell us about that.
So MK Ultra lasted through the 1950s. At the end of the 1950s, Gottlieb concluded finally that mind control is a myth, and that with everything we know about science, we can't do it. It's just in the realm of fiction. So it took him many years and the destruction of many lives. But even though he had not found his holy grail, he was still considered to be a brilliant rising star at the CIA. And in the 1960s and into the 70s, he headed what was called the Technical Services Division at the CIA. That is the division that makes all the tools and all the toys and all the gadgets that spies use. If you've seen any of the James Bond movies or read the books, there's a guy Q. He's the head guy, makes all the gadgets. That's Gottlieb. So Gottlieb conceived all sorts of things, an amazing array of devices. He conceived of an escape kit that you could help you escape from a prison cell that could be concealed in a rectal suppository. And at the other extreme, he constructed a patrol boat to do high-speed surveillance and raids in Vietnam that was completely surrounded by what looked like an old Vietnamese fishing boat. So the whole superstructure looked like a boat, but underneath there was a high-speed American military craft. Another thing that Gottlieb did was craft poisons to be used in assassinations of foreign leaders. He was the one who created the poison pills that were supposed to be given to Fidel Castro, and the poison wetsuit that you read about, and the poison cigars that we tried to get to Castro. All of that was Gottlieb's work. He's the one who created the suicide pins for the U-2 pilots that they were supposed to use if they were captured. So Gottlieb was a real visionary and a big but anonymous figure at the CIA.
Sounds like he was one of the people responsible for programs like Get Smart. But now, after Gottlieb eventually retired from the CIA, and that was in 1973, I believe it was,
yes.
He and his wife, Margaret, embarked on a completely different lifestyle. Tell us about that period, and then what happened after that to force Gottlieb out of those retirement plans.
Gottlieb's story it takes on a whole other dimension when you recognize the fullness of his persona. So as far as we know from his work, he was in many ways demonic and cruel and heartless. And he said later that he found this work very painful and distressing, but very important. He was able to close himself off from human suffering in an amazing way, just by telling himself, all of this is to fight the communists. So you can see him as a kind of one-dimensional character until you understand the other side of his character. Actually, Sidney Gottlieb was a kind of a proto-hippie. In the 1950s, when he was running this super extreme and brutal MK Ultra program, he was living in a way that probably no other federal civil servant was living. He lived in a cabin in the Virginia woods that had no running water. He got up in the morning before dawn to milk his goats. He meditated. He studied Zen. He wrote poetry. By his own account, he took LSD over 200 times. So he only ate natural foods. He did yoga. And he was considered himself a very good-hearted person. Now, when he left the CIA, he was still a young man in his 50s. And he and his wife decided that they would go out and be the compassionate, loving people that they always thought they were, and that Sidney Gottlieb thought he was. Maybe it was a way of repenting for what he had done or trying to even the balance. So they decided to sell their house and just get on a freighter and spend the rest of their lives traveling the world helping the suffering. And they were living at a leper hospital in India 2 years later, when Gottlieb received a most unwelcome message, which said, if I could paraphrase it, this is the CIA calling your old friends, your old employer. We have bad news for you. Somebody has figured out that you exist and they want to talk to you. And the somebody was the U.S. Senate investigating committee, the church committee that was investigating the CIA. So Gottlieb had to come back from India and testify in front of a congressional committee. Now, this was a huge shock because Gottlieb's name was never even known. His face had never been seen. Nobody had know who he was. He was one of the shadowiest figures in the history of the CIA, for sure. Now, he was allowed to testify in private, and he was allowed, at least in the first round, to use a pseudonym. Nonetheless, it was a shock. However, the CIA investigators really didn't know anything about MK Ultra. It was, maybe they thought of it as a little bit of a nutty, extreme project. What they wanted to ask him about was his role in presidentially ordered assassination plots, particularly the plots against Castro. Now, in those plots, Gottlieb was involved. Yeah, he made the pills, he made the poisons, but he was really just a pharmacist. If he hadn't been there, somebody else could have made a poison pill. That wasn't the real Gottlieb story. The real Gottlieb story is MK Ultra. And that actually is how I came to this story. So I had written a book about CIA operations in the 1950s and the CIA director, Allen Dulles. That book was called The Brothers, about Allen Dulles, the CIA director, and his brother, Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State. So in that book, I came across an episode of our overthrowing Prime Minister Lumumba in the Congo in 1960. And it says in the episode that I tell that we actually sent poison to the Congo to try to kill Lumumba. So that stuck in my mind. And I thought, this is really remarkable that the government of the United States sent poison to another country to be used to kill the leader of that country. So I wanted to look into this more. So who was it? Who would have brought the poison? Was it a courier? Well, I find out, no, it was not a courier. It was the chief of the chemical division of the CIA, the guy who made the poison. And his name was Sidney Gottlieb. So then I began to look into Gottlieb, and I saw, yes, it was known that he carried the poison to the Congo, and it was known that he had participated in the Castro poison making. But then the more I learned about him, the more I realized something that the Senate either didn't realize or didn't want to look at, which was that making poisons was just a little sidelight for Gottlieb. The whole MK Ultra thing would not have existed, certainly the way that it emerged without Gottlieb. That was his baby. He created MK Ultra. He was MK Ultra. So that, I realized, is the real story of this very obscure figure. I really believe that I've discovered the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. Unless there was someone else who had a US government issued license to kill and had the ability to requisition prisoners all over the world to have them sent to his torture chambers so that he could experiment on them to death. So this is a huge untold story, and it's one that I'm still recovering from. I'm telling you, having to live with Gottlieb for a couple of years while writing this book was quite a stressful experience, and I haven't quite gotten him out of my mind yet.
Well, okay, considering just how ultra secret this particular division was, and that there were really only a handful of people that knew about it or what it did, how were you able to get this kind of information that completely blows this open?
It's a difficult project. Essentially, I'm writing the biography of a man who didn't exist, of somebody who was so obscure that he lived in total anonymity. How do you put that life back together? Well, it's a mosaic kind of a process. There's a piece here and a piece there. Some pieces have already been written about. I went out and conducted interviews with a number of people who had never spoken about this project before. I found documents that nobody else had found before. Nonetheless, despite all of this, I'm painfully aware that I've only discovered a small part of what Sidney Gottlieb did and what MK Ultra was. As Gottlieb was leaving the CIA, he and the CIA director, Richard Helms, who was leaving at the same time, decided we have to destroy all the MK Ultra records. And Gottlieb personally drove out to the CIA Records Center in Warrenton, Virginia, and supervised the destruction of 7 crates of documents that had all the details of what MK Ultra experiments were carried out and where and when and what their results were. So much of that will never be recovered. I've tried to put together the fullest picture possible, and I think it's going to stand for a while unless we have some new breakthroughs, which I'm always waiting for.
Well, now you've done a lot of research and as you mentioned, work with people like the Dulles brothers, where organizations like the OSS originated. Taking all of that information into account, what's your conclusion about Gottlieb, his CIA colleagues, and that whole period in history?
The greatest justification for committing immoral acts is commitment to some deep cause. Patriotism is one of the deepest and most stirring causes of all. And it's always used to manipulate people's emotions and sentiments. That's not just American, that happens everywhere in the world. I think one of the lessons of the Gottlieb story is that you can't allow appeals to patriotism to destroy your moral sense. We're often being told today, as we were back in Gottlieb's time in the 1950s, we are a very law-abiding and ethical society, but there's sometimes come extreme moments when temporarily we have to put aside our ethics and morality in order to save ourselves. But those temporary moments never seem to end. We always seem to be in a position where we're being told, well, you have to give this up. You can't have these civil liberties anymore. We have to have this kind of surveillance. You have to be open to allowing the CIA to conduct all its operations in secret because the threats we face are so great. I think one of the lessons of the Gottlieb story is not to take those threats at face value, not to lose your moral sense. So my final question that I haven't been able to answer, but I wonder about is this. So Gottlieb finally concluded, as I said, after 10 years of horrific research, that there's no such thing as mind control. And I believe he was right. With the knowledge and the tools and the understanding that was available in the 1950s. Now, we're 70 years later. The advances in artificial intelligence, in computer technology, in all sorts of advanced research into neurology and the workings of the brain. Is it still true that mind control is not possible? And if some extreme project was going on in the 1950s to find out the key to mind control, and nobody knew this, and everyone would have been shocked to know what was happening, is it so inconceivable that the same thing is happening now and that we're waiting for another Stephen Kinzer like 50 years from now to go back and write about what was happening in the 2020s? Based on what I learned in writing this book, it's very hard for me to dismiss that possibility.
That's slightly disturbing to hear. Well, this has been not just a fascinating interview, but I don't think that's a strong enough word. Maybe mesmerizing. It's quite mind-boggling. But Stephen, thanks so much for spending time today to discuss this troubling stage of history and the people behind it. We thank you very much.
Well, writing Poisoner in Chief was a real trauma, but being able to talk about it at least helps me eliminate some of it and share it. Thank you very much.
Therapeutic.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson, and we'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.